This finding about mothers struggling with their mental health, it is being shown kind of time and time again during the pandemic, these rates where people are checking their data. Is this right? Because it's actually pretty alarming that those percentages are going up to 35% of mothers reporting that they're having clinical levels of depression or anxiety. And so there's this thing about parents, this special kind of stress that's happening.
Can you say, "This is Dr. Amanda Zelechoski"?
Why do we have to?
Just try it.
Oh, I can't.
Deep breath. Okay.
This is Dr. Amanda Zelechoski. Lindsay Malloy.
No, wait, say Dr. Lindsay Malloy.
Dr. Lindsay Malloy.
No, come back.
This is Dr. Lindsay Malloy. Welcome to the Parenting Podcast.
One more time.
And then after that, can we have a candy flip?
No.
Please, Mommy.
Okay, ready?
Pandemic Parenting Podcast.
Excellent.
Welcome to Season 2 of the Pandemic Parenting Podcast. I'm Dr. Amanda Zelechoski. My co-host, Dr. Lindsay Malloy, is away on a much-deserved research sabbatical, so I'm going to do my best to hold things down for the both of us on this season of the podcast. Back in 2020, Lindsay and I founded Pandemic Parenting in order to share science-based research and to help all who care for kids navigate this challenging time together. Researchers around the world, including Lindsay and myself, have been hard at work researching the impact of COVID-19 on children and families. We've tracked more than 200 of these studies being published, and this season, we're going to discuss many of the direct implications for us parents. So let's dive in. Please note that the information contained in this podcast and on the Pandemic Parenting website are intended for educational purposes only. Nothing discussed in this podcast or provided on the website are intended to be a substitute for professional psychological advice, diagnosis, or treatment. No doctor-patient relationship is formed between the hosts or guests of this podcast and listeners. If you need the qualified advice of a mental health or medical provider, we encourage you to seek one in your area. Last month, we heard from researchers about the uneven effects of the pandemic on families. In this episode, we speak with scientists who identified similar trends in their own research and will focus more on what families can do. I sat down to speak with two psychology researchers.
I'm Dr. Nicole Racine. I'm a clinical psychologist and independent scientist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, Canada.
I'm Dr. Heather Prime. I'm a clinical psychologist and assistant professor at York University in Toronto in the Department of Psychology.
You'll hear Nicole and Heather share their research findings, including the mental health impact of the pandemic on mothers, the barriers co-parents face, and what this all means for the family unit as a whole. Many thanks to the listeners who shared their own stories of challenges and silver linings during the pandemic. You can leave us a voicemail message also on our website, www.pandemic-parent.org. You're both moms, right? So I think for a lot of us, we dove into this work because we are studying what we are living in many ways. So I just wondered if maybe we could start off by having you tell us a little bit about, you sort of in your mom role and how the pandemic has been for you the last 2 years. Heather, let's start with you.
Sure. I have a little one, so it feels like the pandemic has just occurred simultaneously to my child's life. She's 3 and the pandemic's 2, right? So, for me, I think it's just figuring out how to be a parent while also managing the stress of the pandemic and wondering, is this pandemic? Is this parenting? Is this toddlerhood? And, because we all know that those first few years, there's so many changes with kids and challenges. So a lot of it is just trying to make sense of what's normal and a normal parenting experience versus an experience of living in a pandemic. I will say I feel we're all having different challenges right now, though I do have some appreciation that it wasn't that first year at home. I really am hearing about people who had their babies at the start of the pandemic. So they had that isolation combined with a maternity leave for those who have a maternity leave. And that is a whole other ball game. So I didn't have that same kind of isolation or loneliness that other people are experiencing.
Yeah. In the very beginning, right? Of when your child was born. Yeah. Nicole, what about you?
Yeah, so similar to Heather, also, my daughter's 15 months old when the pandemic hit. And at the time, actually was living quite far away from family and from many natural supports. The first year and first few months were definitely a big adjustment in that regard. And in some ways, having to focus on, what were the things that I could control? What were the things that were ultimately going to make me well and my family well. And I would say maybe some silver linings that came from the pandemic is I think now, when I think about disruptions in childcare, big life changes, I think like, well, how bad could it be? Remember that whole time where the carpet got totally ripped out from under you. And, I think being able now to take a bit of a step back and see that, similar to Heather, was not in the very early stages of parenting, like a very new parent, but many of my friends became parents during the pandemic. And I think for some of them, yes, that was quite an isolating experience. And they had to be creative about, reaching out for support and what that looked like. For some of my friends, we call them sanity walks, which were just, meeting up and going for a walk to be able to, get outside and have some social interaction. And so it has certainly been a process. And I think a lot of people, especially who with young families and who are parenting have learned a lot and have had to demonstrate a lot of resilience.
We invited our listeners to submit voicemails about their experiences parenting during the pandemic. You're about to hear Annette, a mother from California, talk about the challenges she faced during lockdowns. You'll be hearing more parent perspectives throughout our episode today, and we want to hear from you too. Please submit your own voicemail for a chance to be featured on one of our episodes. Go to www.pandemic-parent.org/voicemail. We'd love to hear from you.
Hi there, this is Annette from California. One of the challenges I faced in living life, juggling work and being a mom during the pandemic was just learning how to adjust to going from that role to being professional, a mother, and now teacher in my home, all at the same time.
So in addition to being relatively new moms when this all began for both of you, you've been very busy doing lots of great research and great work. So I want to hear a little bit about that. Nicole, let's start with you this time. So tell us what you've been up to. You've had your hands in lots of different studies.
Yeah, so maybe I can share specifically ones that are related to parenting and maternal mental health. And this is kind of interesting because when the pandemic happened, I think many people realized that this was an opportunity to be able to kind of understand and study a natural experiment, to know and see what was happening for families.
Okay, so for a little context, the American Psychological Association defines a natural experiment as the study of a naturally occurring situation as it unfolds in the real world. So in this case, the naturally occurring situation is the pandemic. The participants aren't in a lab, and researchers are comparing the condition of living through a pandemic with the previous condition of not living through a pandemic. Or perhaps they're looking at some other comparison, like being a parent versus being a child-free adult.
I was very fortunate to be part of a team, actually all of women, who were studying a longitudinal group of women since they were pregnant. And now at the time of the pandemic, their children were around 9 years of age. This is called the All Our Family study in Alberta. So we had many meetings and planning, okay, how do we ask people about what's been going on for them in the pandemic? And there was a lot of Zoom bombing of people's children because the team was comprised of 10 and under children. And it was definitely, even an experiment for us. But what we were able to do was get a bit of a snapshot for a group of women who had been followed before the pandemic. So about, 2,500 of them, to get a sense of throughout the pandemic, how are they doing? And what we actually found was rates of depression and anxiety, clinically significant rates for mothers, went up. And that's not surprising given many of the stressors that were at play. But normally would see maybe about 15 to 20% of women might self-report that they have quite elevated symptoms of anxiety and depression. And what we found was these rates went up to about 30% in that first initial part of the pandemic. So May 2020 to July 2020. And we've since followed the same group of women and followed them again twice during 2021. So kind of in early 2021, and then more recently, late in 2021 during Omicron. And we're just looking at that data now. We're seeing a little decline in some of those rates, but not huge. We're kind of continuing to see elevated levels of mental health stress. And a lot of those are driven by changes in income and work disruptions, as well as lack of childcare. And when people were homeschooling, I think they found that incredibly stressful to be balancing multiple roles.
This finding that Nicole's talking about, mothers struggling with their mental health, it is being shown kind of time and time again during the pandemic, these rates where people are checking their data. Is this right? Because it's actually pretty alarming that those percentages are going up to 35% of mothers reporting that they're having clinical levels of depression or anxiety. And so there's this thing about parents, this special kind of stress that's happening during the pandemic. And one of the things our team has been interested in is, one, how does that look differently for mothers and fathers? And then also, what is the impact of that on families? I sometimes hesitate when I start to say like parents or not, or parents versus non-parents, or moms versus dads. You start to try and compare stress, and everyone's stress is important, and we're talking about averages here, but I also think it is important for us to think about, who's really hurting right now and who needs that extra support. So I'm going to do that thing that, sometimes I worry about doing. But what we found was that when we compare moms and dads, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, mothers were really shouldering the burden of the pandemic. They're reporting higher levels of stress related to financial insecurity, related to managing family conflict, disagreements, how people are getting along, feeling crowded, homeschooling, of course. And then even the more kind of pandemic related things about, worrying about the health of everyone in the family and their loved ones, and who's going to the grocery store and how busy is it and what are the rules. And I mean, I think we can all just relate to that wheel of stress that many mothers were seeing, are reporting that they're really holding that stress more than fathers. So what's important is that we're seeing that those people who are reporting more stress, that is then predicting later on they're showing more mental health problems. So mothers who reported a lot of financial stress, family stress, pandemic, worries about health, that sort of thing, we ask them, 2 or 3 months later, and their mental health has worsened. We always wonder about that. Like, of course, it makes sense to be stressed in a pandemic, but also we want to ask, what does that mean for us? And it means actually, it does lead to this deterioration for mothers over time, more so than fathers.
Yeah. And if you were seeing those effects, right, fairly early on in following these families, I think that's what we're all sort of concerned about as we're immersed in these sorts of studies, is what does this look like in even the further long term? Because it's also not the only type of stress. We know from lots of research before the pandemic, that moms tend to disproportionately carry. And so I think even though we're focused specifically on some of the factors related to the pandemic in these studies that you're both talking about, there's a lot of other stressors that, we can kind of extrapolate and learn from, and crises that families face at different stages. So yeah, I think for a lot of our listeners, what you're describing is not a surprise. I think that there are lots of moms, maybe like the three of us, also listening to this thinking, yes, exactly. We have been really struggling disproportionately as compared to other, groups in the population.
At At Pandemic Parenting, we're committed to making science-based resources immediately available to parents and caregivers. One of our 2022 goals is to ensure that vulnerable families have better access to our resources. Since January, our team has been creating transcripts of our growing catalog of audio resources for parents who are deaf, hard of hearing, or prefer to learn through reading. Our next milestone is to translate these resources into Spanish. Your unrestricted donation will help break down language barriers to get our resources into the hands of Spanish-speaking parents and caregivers. This is where we can use your help. Between Mother's Day on May 8th and Father's Day on June 19th, we have a goal to raise $5,000 to fund our translation project. The funds raised will allow us to hire professional English to Spanish translators with specific expertise in medical and psychological resource translation. Your donation of any size will go a long way in helping us reach our goal. Go to www.pandemic-parent.org/support or follow the link in our show notes to learn more and donate. Thank you for supporting Pandemic Parenting so we can continue to support families.
What do we do with this information, though? I think that's some of the big takeaways we've been trying to translate for parents is, the story can be kind of grim, trying to understand. But as you both sort of mentioned, this wasn't the case for everybody. And it seems like there are some factors that emerged related to how we take this information and then use it to actually make us more resilient, help us kind of weather storms that may still be coming or come in the future. So I wondered if you had any sort of general thoughts about that and, from your work, and then we can kind of dive into some more specifics. So let's start with you, Nicole.
I think we can think about things that can be helpful or strategies at multiple different levels. So we can talk about things that might be helpful for an individual or at the level of a family or broader community system level factors. And a lot of what we've focused on or talked a lot about actually tend to be more of those system level things and how important those are and being able to lean in from an advocacy standpoint. So, for example, how do we support families, young families who are parenting around availability of childcare? How do we support families so that people can take adequate parental leave, not just the birthing parent, but also the partner or main supportive person? How do we make sure that people have the supports they need in their lives from a social support standpoint to feel and be okay, because we know those things are such important buffers. How do we provide people with a basic income so that the stressors related to really severe poverty aren't at play? And so I think these are, some of the things that we really need to advocate for. And they're not, because I think it's easy to say like, well, if you do a little mindfulness or some deep breathing in your day, that's true. As someone who's been struggling to try to have some kind of mindfulness practice for the better part of her life, I do think, these types of things are important. Exercise is important. But there are also things that are much bigger than us that made it so that this was a really stressful time for mothers. And, I heard people talk about the pandemic recovery actually needs to be a she-covery, a recovery where there's an emphasis on income and employment for women, supporting women into the workforce, making sure that we have adequate supports related to childcare. And, I think those things can't be underemphasized.
So Nicole just used a term I hadn't heard before, a she-covery. Our pandemic parenting team did a little research and came across an organization founded by the Chicago Foundation for Women called, you guessed it, She-Covery. They are doing really important and strategic work to tackle some of these systemic barriers and inequities resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic that Nicole and Heather are talking about, like getting women back to work, addressing the eviction crisis, taking care of caregivers, and advocating for an anti-racist healthcare system. I was inspired by their mission and priorities, so I encourage you to check them out and consider how you can support their important work by visiting shecovery.com, which we'll also include in our show notes. Now, back to our conversation. Yeah, that's really important points there. It reminds me of my colleague, Dr. Travis Heath said in his TED Talk, we can't self-care our way out of social inequities, right? And it's just this idea of like, there wasn't enough yoga in the world for me throughout many of the stages of this, or bubble baths or glasses of wine. Like these are systemic issues, that hit certainly some groups much, much harder than others. So I think those are really important pieces. Yeah. Heather, what do you think?
I totally agree with what you're saying and don't want to minimize these systemic changes that need to happen. And I do think sometimes we can start to feel helpless when we're relying on systems that are not supporting us. So I will just plug also thinking about, okay, what can we do within our families? And I've been thinking about this a lot lately because sometimes it's, yes, mindfulness, cognitive behavioral therapy, self-compassion. There's lots of really good resources, but something I'm really interested in is because even that is putting more burden on mothers. Right?
Great point.
So how can we help mothers through connection, right? So by helping to even the burden within the family, engaging partners more, engaging social supports outside of the family. So, we're looking a lot at how we can strengthen what we call the co-parenting unit, right? So it's just, whoever the two partners are, the two parents, if there are two in the home, really thinking about, okay, how can we shift this dynamic where there's kind of one primary caregiver or one person holding all the stress to really balancing, this is a shared unit. And it's not about ticking boxes, who's doing more, who's doing less, but, we're making shared decisions. We're checking in with each other about our values, about how we're parenting, how we're managing the pandemic. When we mess up, we're coming back together to talk about how do we want this to look different. It just becomes, you're kind of strengthening that, the heads of the government, of the family. When you have that strong foundation between the caregivers in the home, it just has these important ripple effects for the whole family. It helps, the parent who's more stressed feel supported. It helps everyone get along better in the family. It helps kids feel like, oh yeah, my parents have got this, right? They're not fighting all the time. And maybe they are, but we're asking parents to do it behind closed doors, right? Rather than in front of their kids. So I think just thinking about shifting the burden a little or sharing the burden is an important conversation.
So that's the program that your lab developed, right? The Love Together, Parent Together program. Is that what you were just describing?
That's a program, yes, that comes from that idea. So something we're studying, it's the Love Together, Parent Together program. I sometimes am like, why did we name it that? But I like it because L2P2, I like saying that. But the idea being that, if we can strengthen that couples unit, then we can parent better. Right. So we're stronger parents when we're a stronger couple. And it's something that we've developed just in direct response to this, this idea where we're trying to just really simply, without a lot of investment among couples, 15 minutes once a month for a few months, we're trying to get them to think about how they're managing their disagreements with one another. So getting them to think about their disagreements in a different way. We usually kind of zone in on our own perspective and say, you this, you that, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, right? We all know that. And so we kind of use these mental hacks to try and get them to step outside of themselves and think of it from a different perspective and what could you do differently. And the idea is that just by playing these kind of mind tricks, our hope is that it will help couples get along better. And as a child psychologist, I do a lot of my work in the name of children. And so our hope is that it will really have ripple effects for, first help the couple, but then also help each of them as individuals, help their parenting and help their children ultimately. And really high hopes for this program.
Yeah, which is great. I mean, and I'm curious about, some of the barriers that you kind of see come up, like as you were describing some of the strategies, it was, making me think in my house, in various stages of the pandemic, obviously our roles got shifted in lots of ways. I mean, sometimes multiple times throughout the day, okay, you're doing this, I'm working for a bit, and then we're going to switch, And I just sort of think about, as we were saying, you don't want to put more burden on mothers, right? However, there are times I could certainly recognize when I was making things more challenging because it would be, well, you have to do it my way, right? Like, yes, I want you to do more and step in these ways, but you have to do it my way. And then of course that creates this process where, people start to feel that kind of learned helplessness or, forget it, or the kids start to default to, well, I know dad always does this, mom always does this. So I'm sort of curious about, both what some of the barriers are that you see come up in these contexts. And then I also want us to think a little bit about, maybe what that looks like as far as strengthening family resilience when they're a single parent homes.
Mm-hmm. I'm really glad you brought that up, because I had this thought and I lost it, and you just reminded me, because as I was talking, I started to feel like, oh, I'm blaming dads, and I don't want to do that, right? Because the dynamic that happens is that we take on the burden and we don't give it up, and I impact how my partner acts and he impacts how I act. So it's that dynamic. So yes, this isn't about fathers need to step up and get more involved. It really is a team effort about how are we going to figure this out? Like, what do I need to do differently to give you some reins, and vice versa? In terms of the barriers, at least for me, and I've seen this in data actually coming out, like the number of alone hours we have with our partners right now is like big thumbs down. I get an hour maybe at the end of the day with my partner. Are we going to watch Netflix, or are we going to talk about our relationship and how things went? So I'm finding personally that it's just hard to find the time to have the conversation when you're calm, after the fact, when you're ready to problem solve, which is what we want couples to do. So those are the barriers for me I'm feeling right now. And I don't know if you asked me to answer how to address those barriers. I'll leave that. I want to hear, Nicole, too, what you think about some of the barriers to this kind of strengthening our family unit.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly the time crunch piece, and that has always existed even before the pandemic. People had a lot of other things, the extracurriculars were jammed in there, all of these extra activities, and being able to prioritize. I think some of what fell away was the supports that maybe people usually relied on. And more in early pandemic, where there were a lot of restrictions, people weren't seeing the grandparents. They weren't having a babysitter come who maybe they, had a date night or something like once a month that they were committed to. Those things fell away. So I agree. Certainly those were some big barriers. And then I think too, being from a gender equity perspective, really being able to consider the lens of who maybe had more to lose in the pandemic. And, certainly in my home, I came to that place where I was like, wait a minute, I have a lot more to lose than you in this context. And I don't think that's universally true, but women being more precariously employed, before the pandemic, making 70 cents on the mail dollar before the pandemic. Mm-hmm. These are all things I think that play into the stress. And if we don't use that lens, or don't have maybe the language to be able to advocate for that, and I put myself in that category, I often don't do a good job of advocating and saying like, oh, wait, this is what I need, and being able to tell, express it, feel like I'm worthy of expressing it, and then actually expressing it. That can be really hard. Maybe for some of us, realizing like, okay, I need to use my voice. I need to say like, this is what I need. These are the things that need to be in place. And then this is how that can be helped, and maybe even problem solving about it. Because sometimes I have ideas that I think are great ideas. And then I talk it through with my partner and they'll say, okay, what about this? And I'm like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Why didn't we just do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Being able to say those things like, my work matters too. And sometimes the discussion, I know in many households defaults, like you said, Nicole, right to the sort of financial piece of this, okay, who's bringing in more income? What does that look like? What I love about you both described too is, we know that our kids are always watching us. So I also just think about sort of strategies you were both describing. What a beautiful gift for your kids to get to see, one or both of their parents, advocating for themselves, watch that kind of modeling of conflict resolution, as you can have those discussions, calmly, rationally, not in the heat of the moment. I think that to me, that's been one of the silver linings too, is our kids getting to sort of watch how we use our voices, how we can be resilient too. So, which makes me then think also about the sort of single parent family construction. So I just wondered about some of the things you were both talking about. How would you adapt that, or any specific thoughts when it comes to a single parent household where all of the, workload is shouldered by one person?
Yeah, I mean, I can say we looked in our research whether marital status was associated with those increases in mental health difficulties, like if it happened more so for single parent families. And actually that didn't bear out. And part of me wonders if you're single parenting, even, before the pandemic, you're having to think about, navigating things and having certain supports in place and having certain standard operating procedures that allow you to live your life in a way that perhaps when you are relying on a partner or on someone else, you may not have necessarily had to. But I think naturally being a single parent, like there's still the people who back you, right? There are still the people who are part of your world, part of your context, who make up your sources of support. That just might look different. And so I think, similar, that really accessing those supports, reaching out for them, drawing them in and being able to use them is really important.
I think that's interesting, Nicole. You were kind of saying that it's almost like single parents had practice of how to keep things going in a world of, limited resources and time and stress. And it's almost like the transition to the pandemic they were prepared for. Am I hitting that?
Yeah. I mean, too, I also don't want to make assumptions about sometimes parenting on your own, maybe for some people is less stressful, than parenting or being in a context that isn't working so I don't want to make assumptions about that it necessarily would, be more stressful. But like this idea, I guess, that perhaps there may have been, skills that people had beforehand that then they were like, all right, I got to implement this, and just did that. Or maybe, I heard a lot from families who were already in intergenerational households. Pandemic hit and they were like, this is, solid. Like, I'm going to go to my job because the grandparents, we all live, we live together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That just reminds me of a conversation we had with two experts in our last season, focused specifically on parenting LGBTQ plus kids or parents who themselves were members of that community. And they said, both of our experts, David Langer and Marissa Pfeiffer, said something similar, that they said, actually before the pandemic, we were already used to having to kind of advocate for our family in different ways, put protective bubbles around our families, just navigate the world a bit differently, knowing a lot of people just don't understand how our family makes decisions. So we already felt practiced at that. And then a lot of other family constellations were having to kind of enter that world. So that kind of reminds me, Heather, how you were framing what Nicole said too.
Yeah. We've been thinking about that with this idea of building resilience in families. And it's kind of like a muscle, right? Like, sometimes we're like, that person's resilient or she's resilient or kids are resilient, but we know that people aren't really inherently resilient. It is this muscle that you have to build up. And I don't know if that's a good metaphor because it's actually the people around you that have to help you build it up. So I don't know, protein powder or something. But, it's almost like, I love that you brought that up, Amanda, like these communities that have had a history of challenges or single parents who, again, not to make assumptions, but that they have had to problem solve and figure it out on how am I doing this as a single parent. They've got that muscle building. And, they might be able to withstand some of the stress that's come from the pandemic. I always find it a hard balance because then you also have the kind of, when you have extended stress and extended, use of that muscle, that can be hard too. So it is this balance that we need to think about when we're thinking about, we're like, oh, how's the pandemic going to impact us? I think in some ways, we're going to, we really could come out stronger if we learn to, communicate with one another and lean on one another and build our relationships and grow. And we need to acknowledge the very real impact it's having on many people and the sorts of supports we need to help people learn from the pandemic, both from a systemic level and in our relationships with one another.
Hi, this is Christy B. from Indiana. The pandemic has been especially hard for single parents like myself. I have 2 little boys who have ADHD, so to have them sit every day was almost impossible. They'd rather be outside like most kids and play. But during this time, it was also scary, just to be able to let them to go outside. So I had to become not only mom and dad, but playmate and teacher as well. And this occupied so much of my time, it took a major toll on my finances. I could see why married couples think that it would be easier for single parents because I was married for 8 years, but this is not the case. After all, one income is better than none. And as of today, the leading people in poverty right now is single moms. There is some good news, though. I was able to stay at home with my kids and spend more time with them. And then also, I was able to pursue my degree and pursue my dreams. My grandmother used to say, life can be wonderful if you do not weaken. This seems appropriate here. We must stay strong, keep going, and think positively.
This is Heather and Ryan from Pennsylvania. But one of the biggest struggles we had is we have 2 children, and our oldest has special needs and obviously receives special ed instruction. And when schools shut down and the only option was for kids to do school virtually at home, it was a huge struggle for our daughter and for us as a family to help her. It just did not work for her at all. It just caused so much stress. So it got to the point that when schools did open, it was a really tough decision because she wasn't yet vaccinated. We weren't yet vaccinated. It was really scary. But we did send her into school because we just felt like it was more important for her to be in school receiving that instruction, and that was worth the risk of getting COVID. In the end, we realized worked out really well for her and for our family.
As we began wrapping up our conversation, I wanted to hear from Nicole and Heather about any silver linings they might have found through their research and experience. Did the pandemic bring about any positive change for parents and their children? How have families benefited from the wider availability of things like telehealth?
There was a bit of a qualitative component to the surveys that we did with families, just, asking them to write in, like, what were some of the things that they did think were silver linings or did benefit from. And there were many people who said, I'm actually appreciating having more time with my kids. I'm actually appreciating a slowing of the hustle bustle. We're doing more enjoyable activities together as a family. We brought out a board game and we haven't ever really done that. Or, we got a pet, or we've been spending more time outside. And so I think it's also important for us to attend to those things. And I think, we also can't discount that some people actually reported their mental health improved during the pandemic. And I think we can probably all think of some examples of that. And so there are aspects of how our life shifted and changed that worked well for some people. And I think that's not to discount a lot of challenge that was there. And I think challenge that wasn't equally distributed, across groups and things like that. But certainly there were some things that improved. And to your point around service delivery and telemental health, we saw a dramatic shift in the availability of those types of supports. And I can say as a, practitioner myself, there's so many barriers pre-pandemic to be able to engage in telemental health. That COVID happened, it was like, woo, we're all doing teletherapy. Yep. And that is, I talk to my colleagues now who are working in mental health care, who are, working in hybrid models and things like that. How wonderful for people that they can now both have access more easily, barrier free to mental health services, but also for the practitioners to be able to, perhaps take a little bit better care of themselves, or who are traditionally, I think, providers who often experience burnout and who there's a high level of turnover and things like that. So that's been a huge advantage. And I know certainly there was some nice research done here in Canada that actually showed there was a big uptick in women's use in the postpartum period of telemental health and mental health supports during the pandemic. And some of that might be there was increased need, but there was also increased availability. People were actually able to access it. And I think of myself in, the 6 weeks postpartum, like leaving my couch was a big deal. Yeah. If I made it to an appointment, like kudos to myself. And then usually I cried after, so right. I think this idea that you could do it, have appointments in your home, I think is really wonderful.
Well, and depending how far your therapist is from you, packing up the baby, getting in the car, it's just a whole thing, which, right, those first weeks and months out, there's no way. That's just overwhelming in itself to think about leaving the house, period, much less, all of the other barriers we know tending to kind of postpartum mental health issues. So I think those are great examples. Thank you. Heather, what do you think?
I was just going to add to that I think it's been a real blessing for remote communities as well. I mean, we're in Ontario in Canada, and before the pandemic, There were service use shortages for children's mental health, big shortages, and particularly, of course, in some groups and, particularly for remote communities.
Right.
And so this evolution of telehealth it's absolutely a game changer in terms of reach and accessibility. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Just in terms of some of the resilience building things within families, I loved all the things you listed, Nicole, that your families wrote about what's going well for them, because we found the exact same thing when we asked our families getting outdoors more, spending more time together, and so on and so forth. And I think what we know from pre-pandemic and that we think about now is this idea of flexibility. Our lives were totally uprooted in March 2020. And again, at least for us, many times afterwards with lockdowns, and who knows where we're going now. And I think the struggle is when we try to hold on too tightly to the old way and we don't adapt. So that flexibility, that adaptation is really important. I think it's really important for families to keep a finger on that pulse on, what are our rules? What are our routines? How are they working for us? How are we having fun? And those are the first things to go when we're really stressed. So,
yeah. And how to sort of help us empower ourselves to take control in situations when it feels like it's out of our control. So as you were describing some of those things, Heather, too, I was thinking about, just the boundaries at different stages and, same for our kids, right? Like school was home and home was school. And just, that there were times I actually felt even more empowered. Like, you know what? You're not joining your Zoom class today because you're having a really hard time, and it's okay. We're just going to go outside and do something fun. Like we could empower ourselves to say, no, we're just not doing that today. And I ironically felt more empowered sometimes on those days than I did when, things are normal or back to normal or whatever, that we default into these structures or feeling like we don't have a voice sometimes to advocate for what our family needs or what we might need. So I think those were great examples. So I'm curious, as we sort of wrap up for each of you, like, what was the thing for you that you learned in your family? Like Heather, you've talked about, trying to help families serve as this like island of strength, which I just love that image and that characterization. So what was it for you in your family that you've kind of taken away from all of this?
I think for me, Nicole alluded to this, the reprioritization of things. I love my work. I get great joy from it. And the pandemic was the first time when I was really able to shift and reprioritize family. Of course, I always prioritize my family, but before I was with my family and I was thinking about work, or I was stressed about work, or I was itching to get back to my email. It was really hard for me to be present, and the slowing down and the feeling of helplessness and being out of control, and really that is what it is, the island of strength. I was like, my family, this is what we've got. We're sitting here for, it's going to be months or weeks. We're going to go for 20 walks a day. It just was like really, really grounding to slow down. And I mean, it sounds kind of cliche, but just reevaluate what was important, and that the work will always be there. And at the end of the day, I just really, that reprioritization of family is what came for me early-ish in the pandemic, and it has stuck.
Nice. Nicole, what about you?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I really appreciate that. Heather, I'll share something maybe much more simplistic that immediately popped into my head, which was related to something Heather was saying around rituals. Was we made Friday nights in our family a big ritual. Something about celebrating the week became like, we never did that as much before, but I think we really needed to say like, good job, everybody, you made it to Friday. And we are like making pizza. We are watching movies. We are, in the summer, it's like, we're meeting people at the hill, and every Friday we're eating ice cream. It just became what is happening this Friday? That is a big thing. Like we were calling it TGIF, and so that has stuck. Every, Friday afternoon, Friday evening, it's like, what's our thing? What's our thing? What's the thing that we're looking forward to? And I think the pandemic made us do that.
Hi, this is Becca. I have a silver lining from the pandemic to share. Once my kids were back in school in the fall of 2020 and I was still working from home, it was so much easier to keep up with everything around the house, from grocery shopping to meals to cleaning to general upkeep and keeping track of all of the kids' activities. I really enjoyed having all that extra time at home instead of being in the office, and was able to get so much done in between work meetings. Thanks for all you guys are doing with pandemic parenting.
Hi there, this is Annette from California. A silver lining that I discovered through the work of the Pandemic Parent webinars was the importance of maintaining an internal state of peace and regulation within myself, making sure that I took time for myself to manage the stressors that were associated from dealing with the pandemic and all that it encompassed. I'm well aware of the importance of making sure that my children, their social, emotional, and mental health is important in order for them to absorb and be able to learn and take in information, all within the new environment that the pandemic forced us to be learning and working in. But there also was the importance of myself as a parent, a working mom at the same time, to make sure that I found ways to maintain my inner peace, my state of social, emotional, and mental wellness in order to be successful for them. And it was hard to find balance that way, but you needed to really make an effort to take time to give yourself time to allow that for yourself. And that was a silver lining to me. And hearing professionals speak to that and the importance of that was definitely helpful.
This has been an episode of the Pandemic Parenting Podcast. We'd love to connect with you via email or on social media. Follow the links in our show notes or look for our blue and yellow logo when you search Pandemic Parenting on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, or TikTok. And this podcast isn't all we do. Pandemic Parenting is a 501c3 nonprofit providing free science-based resources for parents and all who care for children while navigating the COVID-19 pandemic. To learn more about our organization and access our extensive library of webinars, videos, blogs, and more, visit www.pandemic-parent.org. This season of the podcast is produced by Victoria Bruick, Carmen Vincent, and myself, Dr. Amanda Zelechoski, with strategic support from Dr. Lindsay Malloy and Pandemic Parenting's Executive Director, Jennifer Valentine. Many thanks to the Pandemic Parenting team for their work in making this show happen, including Miranda Dauphiny, Lydia Lang, Julianne Matthews, Mark Snow, and Paula Sillers. If you want to support the work of Pandemic Parenting, you can do so in a few ways. You can leave us a 5-star rating and review on Apple or Spotify. You can donate to our nonprofit at www.pandemic-parent.org/support. And lastly, and most importantly, you can share this episode with parents and caregivers in your communities. Until next time, thanks for listening, and please give yourself some grace today.